In 2009, an American company stood on the field at the Australian Football League Grand Final in front of 100,000 people at the Melbourne cricket ground and 3 million more watching on television, and announced the new name of Vegemite. The most Australian product ever made. The black yeast paste that soldiers carried through Tobruk and El Alamein. The spread in the lunchbox of every Australian child for 3 generations. The jingle more Australians can sing than the national anthem. And the American company that owned it, within 4 days the name was dead. The backlash was so total, so national, so furious, that Kraft killed it 96 hours after launching it. But here is the part of the story that the iSnack disaster actually exposed. Vegemite was not Australian. Vegemite had not been Australian since 1935. For 74 years at that point, and 82 years in total, the spread that defined Australian identity had been owned by an American food conglomerate that understood it so poorly, it nearly destroyed it with a name that sounded like an iPhone accessory. The man who invented Vegemite, a chemist named Cyril Callister, made it out of the waste yeast that breweries were throwing away. The man who founded the company, Fred Walker, died before his creation ever became famous. The factory where it has been made since 1923 sits on a street in Port Melbourne that was renamed One Vegemite Way, and the smell that comes off that factory is so distinct it has been recognised by the City of Melbourne as having heritage value. This is the story of how the most Australian thing in the world was owned by America for 82 years. And how in 2017, an Australian dairy company from a small town in New South Wales finally bought it back. This is the one that came home. Before we go any further, hit like and subscribe. Every subscriber keeps these stories alive. Chapter 1. The Brewery Waste. Here is the part of the Vegemite story nobody tells. It was invented out of garbage. In 1919, the First World War had just ended, and Australia had a problem. The country had developed a taste for a British yeast extract spread called Marmite, a sticky brown paste that British factory workers and schoolchildren had been eating since 1902. But the war had disrupted British imports. Marmite was getting harder to get. There was a gap in the Australian market, and a Melbourne businessman named Fred Walker saw it. Fred Walker was not a chemist. He was a salesman and a businessman, and he had already failed once. Born in Melbourne on the 5th of January 1884, Walker had built a trading company in Hong Kong, watched it collapse, and come home to rebuild. The second incarnation of Fred Walker and Company was a Melbourne food business, and Walker had a talent that mattered more than chemistry. He understood that a product was only as good as the story you could tell about it, but he needed someone who could actually make the thing. So in 1919, Walker hired a young chemist named Cyril Percy Callister. Callister was the real genius of this story, and almost nobody knows his name. He was born on the 16th of February 1893 at Shute, a tiny farming settlement near Beaufort in rural Victoria. He was brilliant. He took a Bachelor of Science from the University of Melbourne in 1914, a Master of Science in 1917, and would later earn a Doctorate of Science in 1931. During the First World War, he had worked in the Australian Imperial Forces munitions branch, a chemist making explosives for the war effort. After the war, he needed work, and Fred Walker gave it to him. The brief was simple and strange. Make an Australian version of Marmite. Make it out of whatever you can find. What Callister found was waste. Every brewery in Australia, at the end of the brewing process, was left with an enormous quantity of spent brewer's yeast. The dead yeast cells left over after the beer was made. The breweries threw it away. It was a waste product. It was garbage. And it was one of the richest known natural sources of the vitamin B group on Earth. Callister went to the Carlton and United Brewery at its Abbotsford site on the Yarra River in Melbourne and took their waste yeast. He used a process called autolysis to break down the yeast cells, letting the cell's own enzymes digest themselves into a liquid. He concentrated the clear liquid extract. He blended it with salt, with celery extract, with onion extract, and a few other ingredients he kept secret. What he ended up with was a thick, dark brown, sticky black paste with a powerful, salty, savoury flavour. He had turned brewery garbage into food. The recipe Callister developed in 1922 is virtually unchanged, the same recipe used today. Over 100 years later, Vegemite is still made from spent brewer's yeast from that same Abbotsford brewery. The product that became the symbol of Australian identity began as the thing the beer industry was throwing in the bin. It is worth pausing on what Callister actually did, because it was genuinely clever. Yeast cells are tiny factories packed with proteins, amino acids, and B group vitamins. The problem is getting all of that out of them. Callister's process, autolysis, used the yeast's own digestive enzymes against itself. Warm the spent yeast under the right conditions, and the cells break themselves down from the inside, releasing a brown liquid dense with everything the brewing process had concentrated. Filter out the cell walls, boil the liquid down to a paste, season it with salt and vegetable extracts, and you have a shelf-stable spread that delivers a wallop of nutrition from a raw material that cost almost nothing because nobody else wanted it. It was, in the language of a later century, the ultimate circular product, a waste stream turned into a national staple. And Callister was not just a competent chemist filling a brief. He was one of the finest food technologists Australia would ever produce. In 1931, alongside Sir David Rivett, he helped secure the Royal Charter for the Royal Australian Chemical Institute. He gave his professional life to a black paste that, for its first 15 years, almost nobody would buy. Chapter 2. The Name in the Hat. By 1922, Fred Walker had his product. What he did not have was a name. Walker, the marketing man, decided to make the naming of the product into a marketing event in itself. He ran a national competition. Members of the public were invited to submit a name for the new spread, and the prize pool was £50 Australian, a serious amount of money in 1922, equivalent to roughly $4,500 today. The entries came in, and from all of them, the winning name was selected by Fred Walker's daughter, Sheila Walker, who, according to company legend, drew it from a hat. The name was Vegemite. Nobody knows who actually submitted it. The records of the person who coined the word have been lost. The most Australian word in the English language, a word now in every dictionary, a word that has become a metonym for Australia itself, was invented by an anonymous member of the public who won £50 and then vanished from history. Vegemite was registered as a trademark, and the product first appeared on Australian shelves on the 25th of October 1923. The label called it pure vegetable extract. The marketing emphasised that it was good for children, packed with the B vitamins that Callister had captured from the brewery yeast. And then, having invented a genuinely revolutionary product and given it a perfect name, Fred Walker watched it fail. It failed completely. For year after year, Australians had Marmite. They knew Marmite. They did not want this strange black Australian paste from a company they had never heard of. Through the mid-1920s, Vegemite sat on shelves and did not move. Fred Walker had a brilliant chemist, a perfect product, a perfect name, and nobody was buying it. So in 1928, he did something that, with the benefit of 100 years of hindsight, is one of the most extraordinary marketing decisions in Australian history. He changed the name. Chapter 3. Parwill. In 1928, Fred Walker renamed Vegemite. The new name was Parwill. The logic was a pun, and once you understand it, You cannot ununderstand it. The British competitor was called Marmite. Walker reasoned, Marmite sounds like Marmite, so his product would be Parwill. If Marmite, then Parwill. Marmite, Parwill. It is genuinely one of the worst ideas in the history of Australian commerce, and it came from the same marketing instinct that had produced the brilliant naming competition 5 years earlier. Walker thought a pun on the competitor's name would steal the competitor's customers. Instead, it confused everybody. Nobody got the joke. Nobody knew what Parwill was. The product that was already failing under the name Vegemite now failed even harder under the name Parwill. Remember this moment. 81 years later, an American corporation would make almost exactly the same mistake. A clever rebrand that misunderstood the product entirely, and it would be called iSnack 2.0. The difference is that when Fred Walker did it, it was his own company, his own gamble, his own failure to learn from. When the Americans did it, it was a national insult. The Parwill experiment was quietly abandoned. The product went back to being called Vegemite. And here, in the late 1920s, the story takes the turn that defines everything that follows. Because Fred Walker, struggling to sell his yeast spread, made a deal with an American. In 1926, Fred Walker partnered with James L. Kraft of Chicago, the founder of the Kraft cheese empire, to form a new company called the Kraft Walker Cheese Company. The deal was about cheese. Walker wanted the Australian rights to Kraft's patented method of making processed cheese, the stuff that could sit on a shelf without refrigeration. In exchange, the American Kraft got a foothold in the Australian market. At the time, this was a cheese deal. Vegemite was a failing side project. Nobody in 1926 thought the most important thing about the Kraft Walker Cheese Company would turn out to be the black yeast paste that wasn't selling. But the deal mattered because it put an American hand inside Fred Walker's company. And in 1935, that hand closed around the whole thing. Chapter 4. The Death of Fred Walker. Fred Walker died on the 21st of July 1935. He was 51 years old. He died before Vegemite became famous. He died before the jingle, before the war that made it a national icon, before the billion jars. He had invented one of the most successful consumer products in Australian history, and he never saw it succeed. At the time of his death, Vegemite was still a modest seller, propped up by clever marketing and the slow, grinding work of Cyril Callister, who never stopped believing in the product he had built out of brewery waste. And when Fred Walker died, his company was absorbed. The Fred Walker Company was rolled into the Kraft Walker Cheese Company, the joint venture with the Americans, which was itself a subsidiary of Kraft of Chicago. The Australian founder was dead. The American multinational took control of everything he had built, including Vegemite. This is the moment. 1935. This is when Vegemite stopped being Australian. It would not be Australian again for 82 years. Most Australians have never known this. The single most patriotic food product in the country, the one that gets packed in the suitcases of homesick expats, the one that defines the national palate, the one that Australians use to torture visiting foreigners, was, from 1935 onward, a line item on the balance sheet of an American corporation headquartered 8,000 miles away in Illinois. And the cruel irony is this: the Americans were about to make it a household name. Because what Kraft did with Vegemite in the years after Fred Walker's death was a masterclass in marketing. The thing Fred Walker could never crack, getting Australians to actually buy the stuff, the Americans cracked within a few years. In a 2-year campaign in the late 1930s, Kraft gave Vegemite away for free. If you bought Kraft Walker cheese products, you got a jar of Vegemite with a coupon. They ran poetry competitions with brand new imported American Pontiac motor cars as the prizes. They flooded the country with the product. And crucially, in 1939, they secured an endorsement from the British Medical Association, which officially recognised Vegemite as a rich source of B vitamins. That endorsement changed everything. Vegemite was no longer a strange black paste. It was medicine. It was health. It was good for your children, and doctors said so. Sales finally began to climb. And then the war came, and the war turned Vegemite from a successful product into a sacred one. Chapter 5. The War. When the Second World War broke out, the Australian Army did something that would cement Vegemite into the national identity forever. It bought Vegemite in bulk, as a military ration. The logic was nutritional. Vegemite was packed with B vitamins. It did not spoil. It was light, and it could be squeezed into a soldier's mess kit. The Army issued it in 2 sizes, a 7-ounce tin for bulk use, and a half-ounce, 14-gram, individual ration pack that a soldier could carry in his kit. Australian soldiers carried Vegemite through the North African campaign, through the siege of Tobruk, through El Alamein, through the jungle fighting of the Owen Stanley Range in New Guinea, on the Kokoda Track, in some of the most brutal conditions any Australian soldiers have ever fought in. A taste of home, in a 14-gram foil pack, in the pocket of a man who did not know if he would see Australia again. There was a hard logic to it, beyond sentiment. Soldiers in the field, living on tinned and dried rations for months, were vulnerable to vitamin B deficiency diseases. Beriberi, pellagra, the kind of ailments that wreck an army from the inside without a shot being fired. Vegemite was, in effect, a vitamin supplement disguised as a comfort food. The army quartermasters who ordered it in bulk were not being sentimental. They were keeping men healthy. But to the men eating it, it was not a supplement. It was Saturday morning. It was their mother's kitchen. It was the country they had left. And because the army was taking so much of it, there was not enough left for civilians. The company, now Kraft controlled, had to ration Vegemite to the Australian public on a per capita basis. You could not just buy as much as you wanted. There was a shortage because the soldiers came first. This is the thing that turned Vegemite into an icon. Scarcity. Absence. For the duration of the war, ordinary Australian families could not easily get the spread they had finally come to love because their sons and husbands and fathers were eating it in the desert and the jungle. Vegemite became associated with the soldiers, with sacrifice, with home, with the things you missed and the things you are fighting for. There is a detail from this period that captures how precious it had become. In 1944, a 39-year-old man was sentenced to 2 months in prison for unlawful possession of stolen goods. Among the stash police found in his possession were 2 tins of Vegemite. It was valuable enough to steal, valuable enough to go to jail for. One wartime advertisement showed a child doing his bit for his dad, giving up his share of Vegemite so it could go to the soldiers at the front. The marketing wrapped the product in the flag. And it was true enough to work because the soldiers really were carrying it, and the families really were going without. When the war ended, the soldiers came home, and they came home with a lifelong attachment to the taste of the black paste that had been in their ration kits. The post-war baby boom and the great wave of post-war migration did the rest. A whole generation of Australian children was raised on Vegemite on toast, Vegemite in sandwiches, Vegemite as the first solid flavour many of them ever tasted. By the early 1950s, Vegemite was no longer a product. It was a national institution, and the American company that owned it was about to give it the single most famous piece of advertising in Australian history. Chapter 6. Happy Little Vegemites. In 1954, an advertising executive named Alan Weeks, working at the agency J. Walter Thompson in Sydney, wrote a jingle. It was recorded at the EMI studios in Sydney. It featured a trio of bright, energetic children singing to a toe-tapping tune. And the words were these, words that, the sources agree, almost every Australian over the age of 40 can still sing on command, without prompting, with gusto. We're happy little Vegemites, as bright can be. We all enjoy our Vegemite for breakfast, lunch and tea. Our mummy says we're growing stronger every single week because we love our Vegemite. We all adore our Vegemite. It puts a rose in every cheek. The jingle first aired on radio in 1954. When television arrived in Australia in 1956, Kraft adapted it into a TV campaign with a troupe of pantomime children dressed in little marching uniforms. The campaign ran on and off through to the late 1960s. In the early 1980s, the original commercials were remastered and colorized and broadcast to an entirely new generation of Australian children who learned the song just as their parents had. It ran again in 2010. In 2023, for the 100th anniversary, the company filmed a brand new version with children chosen from 10,000 applicants nationwide. The phrase, "Happy Little Vegemite," entered the Australian language. It became a semi-ironic way of describing someone who is contented, satisfied, pleased with their lot. Who's a happy little Vegemite? It is used by people who have never thought about the advertisement it came from. It is simply part of how Australians speak. The jingle is, by common agreement, more widely known than the Australian national anthem. More Australians can sing "Happy Little Vegemites" accurately than can sing "Advance Australia Fair." It has been called the most successful jingle in Australian advertising history. And there was a second piece of music that sealed Vegemite into the national identity, this one not commissioned by anyone. In 1981, the Australian band Men at Work released Down Under, a song that would top the charts in Australia, the United Kingdom and the United States, and become an unofficial national anthem in its own right. Its most famous verse describes a traveller meeting a towering man in Brussels who hands him a Vegemite sandwich. For millions of people around the world who had never seen a jar of the stuff, that lyric was the first they ever heard of Vegemite. An Australian band conquering the global charts, choosing Vegemite as the single object that meant home. The brand did not pay for that. It did not have to. By 1981, Vegemite was so completely fused with Australian identity that a rock band reached for it instinctively as shorthand for the country itself. And every bit of that identity was attached to a product owned by an American corporation. This is the strange double life of Vegemite through the entire second half of the 20th century. To Australians, it was the most Australian thing imaginable. The taste of childhood, the taste of home, the thing in the army ration pack, the thing in the jingle everyone knew, the thing in the song that conquered the world. To the balance sheet, it was a line item in the Australian division of an American food giant. The two facts coexisted, and almost no Australian ever stopped to think about the second one. There were milestones that showed how deep it had embedded itself. In April 1984, a 115-gram jar of Vegemite became the very first product in Australia to be electronically scanned at a supermarket checkout. The first barcode ever scanned in the country was on a jar of Vegemite. In October 2008, the billionth jar of Vegemite rolled off the line at the Port Melbourne factory. 1 billion jars, from a product that had failed for 15 straight years and been renamed Parwill. Through all of it, the factory stayed in Port Melbourne, where it had been since 1923. The recipe stayed virtually unchanged. The yeast still came from the brewery. The only thing that was not Australian was the ownership. And then, in 2009, the Americans decided to modernise. Chapter 7. iSnack 2.0. By 2009, Vegemite was owned by Kraft Foods, and Kraft had an idea. The idea itself was not bad. Kraft had noticed that some Australians liked to mix Vegemite with cream cheese, spreading both on toast or blending them for a milder, smoother, more dippable taste, especially for children who found pure Vegemite too intense. So, Kraft developed a new product, a blend of Vegemite and Philadelphia cream cheese, smoother and milder than the original. It was a genuine innovation, and when it launched, it sold 2 million jars in its first 2 months and reached 12% household penetration almost immediately. The product was fine. The problem was the name. Kraft did not have a name for the new blend, so they turned to the same trick that had worked for Fred Walker in 1922. They ran a public competition. The Name Me campaign launched in June 2009, with the new spread going on shelves in temporary packaging that simply said, "Name Me." Kraft received 48,000 suggestions. They sold 3 million jars during the 3-month contest. The most popular suggested name was Cheesymite, but that was already trademarked by someone else. So the Kraft marketing team went through the other suggestions and chose one. They picked a modified version of a suggestion called iSpread 2.0. They wanted something that sounded modern, digital, youthful, something that would appeal to the iPod generation, the Web 2.0 era. The reasoning in the room must have felt sharp and contemporary. Apple's I prefix was everywhere. 2.0 signaled an upgrade, a new version, the future. To a marketing executive in 2009, iSnack 2.0 probably sounded like exactly the kind of name that would drag a 100-year-old spread into the 21st century. They chose iSnack 2.0. And on the 26th of September 2009, at the Australian Football League Grand Final, the single biggest television event of the Australian year, with 100,000 people in the Melbourne cricket ground and around 3 million watching on television, Kraft announced to the nation that the new Vegemite would be called iSnack 2.0. The announcement was made with fanfare, at the most watched moment of the Australian sporting calendar, in front of the largest possible audience. Kraft was proud of it. They thought they had a winner. The reaction was instant, total, and savage. Within hours, Japs's Vegemite was trending on Twitter. The tech-savvy young generation that the name was specifically designed to appeal to was the generation that hated it most. They understood the I and 2.0 references perfectly, which is exactly why they found them so embarrassing. One person wrote that iSnack 2.0 is a travesty in both name and substance. Stick to the real Vegemite, people. Another wrote, "So I tried Vegemite's new iSnack today. It is safe to say I hate it." A dedicated website appeared called Names That Are Better Than iSnack 2.0. Talkback radio lit up. Newspaper columnists weighed in. One commentator suggested that the 27-year-old web designer who had submitted the winning name should be run naked through the streets of Sydney as retribution for his cultural crime. The word that came up again and again, in tweet after tweet and call after call, was un-Australian. Kraft's spokesperson, Simon Talbot, defended the name, saying it had been chosen for its personal call to action, relevance to snacking, and clear identification of a new and different Vegemite to the original. It was the kind of corporate language that only made things worse. It sounded like a focus group, not a country. Even the man who suggested the name sounded sheepish afterward, admitting it was all a bit tongue-in-cheek, really. The I phenomenon and Web 2.0 have been recent revolutions, and I thought the new Vegemite name could do the same. It did not matter. The backlash was unstoppable, and it was unanimous in a way that almost nothing in Australian public life ever is. And on the 30th of September 2009, 4 days after the grand final announcement, Kraft surrendered. They announced they were pulling the name. iSnack 2.0 had existed, as the official name of a Vegemite product for 96 hours. The jars already printed and sitting in warehouses had to be sold off before the renamed product could ship. Kraft ran another poll to choose a replacement, and this time they listened to it. The new name was Cheesy Bite, close to Cheesymite, the name the public had wanted all along before the marketing team overruled it. The iSnack 2.0 disaster became a global case study in brand management, taught in marketing courses around the world as an example of what happens when a company misunderstands the cultural weight of the product it owns. But the deeper lesson, the one the marketing textbooks usually miss, was about ownership. iSnack 2.0 happened because an American corporation looked at the most beloved Australian product in existence and saw a snack brand that needed a youth marketing refresh. They did not feel what Australians felt about it, because it was never theirs to feel. They owned it. They did not belong to it. The iSnack 2.0 disaster was the moment that exposed the truth Australians had never quite reckoned with. Their national spread was owned by people who did not understand it, and within a few years that was finally going to change. Chapter 8. The company with the made-up name. In 2012, the company that owned Vegemite tore itself in half. Kraft Foods, the American giant that had owned Vegemite since 1935, split into two separate companies. One half kept the Kraft name and the North American grocery business. The other half, which took the global snacks business, was given a new invented name, Mondelez International. The name was reportedly assembled from a Latinish root for world and a coined syllable for delicious. It was the kind of corporate name that exists in no human language and means nothing to anyone. Vegemite ended up inside Mondelez. So now the most Australian product in the world was owned by a company with a made-up name, headquartered in Illinois, that most Australians had never heard of and could not pronounce. The jar still said Vegemite. The factory was still in Port Melbourne. The recipe was still Cyril Callister's. The jingle was still the jingle. But the entity that collected the profits was a global snacking conglomerate that had Vegemite sitting in a portfolio next to Oreos and Cadbury and Toblerone. For Mondelez, Vegemite was a small Australian asset. The company's strategic focus was on what it called its power brands: Cadbury Dairy Milk Chocolate, Oreo biscuits, the global mega brands that sold in hundreds of countries. Vegemite was a beloved local product in one mid-sized market. It did not fit the strategy. It was, in the language of corporate portfolio management, a non-core asset. And non-core assets get sold. In January 2017, Mondelez announced it would sell most of its grocery business in Australia and New Zealand, the local brands that did not fit the global power brand strategy. Vegemite was on the list. After 82 years, the most Australian product in the world was, once again, for sale. The question was, who would buy it? It could have gone to another multinational. It could have gone to a private equity fund that would have done to Vegemite what private equity did to Arnott's and Streets: load it with debt, sell the factory, lease it back, strip the margin, and flip it again in 5 years. Vegemite could have ended up owned by an investment fund in New York or London, the way so many other Australian icons did. It could have become a portfolio asset, passed from owner to owner, its Australianness reduced to a marketing decoration on a jar controlled from the other side of the world. That was the likely outcome. That is what usually happens. Australia's commercial history is a graveyard of icons that went offshore and never came back. Holden, Arnott's, Streets, Peters, Speedo, half the country's beer brands. The default ending for an Australian icon put up for sale by a foreign multinational is another foreign owner. Instead, against the odds, it was bought by a dairy cooperative from a small town in New South Wales. Chapter 9. coming home. The buyer was Bega. Bega cheese is named after the town of Bega, on the far south coast of New South Wales, where it was founded in 1899 as a farmers' cooperative. Dairy farmers pooling their milk to process and sell it together. For more than a century, it had been a quietly successful Australian dairy business, the kind of company most Australians knew only from the cheese in the supermarket fridge. It was about as far from a Chicago snacking conglomerate as a company could be. It had no global power brands. It had no head office in Illinois. It had cows and farmers and 118 years of operating in the same corner of rural New South Wales. On the 18th of January 2017, Bega announced it was buying most of Mondelez's Australian and New Zealand grocery business, including Vegemite and other long-running local brands, for 460 million Australian dollars. The reaction was the precise opposite of the iSnack disaster. Where iSnack had produced national fury, the Bega buyback produced national joy. The newspapers ran headlines like, "Australia hails buyback of national spread." Radio hosts celebrated. The story made international news. The BBC, the wire services, outlets around the world ran the tale of the Australian spread coming home. After 82 years of American ownership, after the war rations and the jingle and the billion jars and the iSnack humiliation, Vegemite was Australian again. Bega's executive chairman, Barry Irvin, put it in the language of heritage rather than the language of finance. He spoke of the wonderful heritage and values that Vegemite represents and its importance to Australian culture. He was not talking like a man who had bought an asset. He was talking like a man who had brought something home. And there was a neatness to it that no scriptwriter would dare invent. Vegemite, born from the waste of an Australian brewery, made by a chemist from a tiny Victorian farming town, was returning to the ownership of farmers. A dairy cooperative whose roots were in exactly the kind of small, practical, unglamorous Australian enterprise that had created it in the first place. And then Bega did the thing that made it official. The small visible symbol that meant more than the $460 million. For the first time in the history of the product, the Bega logo appeared on the Vegemite jar. An Australian company's name, on the Australian icon, on the shelf of every Australian supermarket. The Cheesy Bite product, the survivor of the iSnack disaster, was eventually renamed simply Vegemite and Cheese. This is the ending that Arnott's never got. It is the ending that Streets never got. Peter's Ice Cream is owned in a village in North Yorkshire. Arnott's is owned by a private equity fund on Hudson Yards. Streets is owned by a multinational in Europe. They were all stolen, and none of them came back. Vegemite came back. It is the exception. It is the one Australian food icon that went away for 82 years and then returned to Australian hands. And it returned not to another conglomerate, but to a farmers' cooperative from a town of a few thousand people on the south coast. The closest thing in this story to the kind of small Australian business that Fred Walker and Cyril Callister were running when they invented the thing in the first place. But this is not a fairy tale, and the coda has a twist. Chapter 10. One Vegemite Way. Vegemite has been made at the same factory in Port Melbourne since 1923. In 2016, the street the factory sits on was officially renamed One Vegemite Way. There is now a corner in Port Melbourne where Vegemite Way meets Salmon Street, arguably the least appetising intersection in Australia. And people stop to take photographs of the sign. The factory makes more than 22 million jars a year. Roughly one for every person in the country. The billionth jar was made in 2008. The count has climbed by hundreds of millions since. The recipe is still virtually unchanged, the one Cyril Callister developed out of brewery waste in 1922. And the smell that comes off the factory, the thick, malty, yeasty smell of Vegemite being made is so distinctive, so woven into the area, that when the City of Melbourne reviewed the heritage of the Fisherman's Bend Industrial Precinct, the National Trust lobbied for the smell itself to be recognised. The council stopped short of formally declaring the smell significant, because doing so might have complicated future development of the area. But the smell was written into the official heritage record of the site. A smell, heritage listed, in everything but the final word. Here is the twist. In 2022, Bega, the Australian company, the heroes of this story, the ones who brought Vegemite home, listed the Vegemite factory for sale. The 99-year-old building at 1 Vegemite Way was put on the market with price expectations of around $150 million and a plan to lease it back. The same sale-and-leaseback move that KKR pulled on Arnott's. The same logic that turned Streets into a tenant in its own factory. Even under proud Australian ownership, the building where Vegemite has been made for a century is now an asset to be sold, with Vegemite as the tenant. And the yeast, the brewery waste that the whole thing is made from, the spent yeast from the Carlton and United Brewery at Abbotsford that Cyril Callister first used in 1922, still comes from that same Abbotsford brewery. Except the brewery is no longer Australian. Carlton and United Breweries was bought by the Japanese beverage giant Asahi in 2020. So, the core ingredient of the most Australian product in the world, the one that finally came home to an Australian owner, is supplied by a brewery owned by a Japanese multinational. That is the real complicated modern truth of Vegemite. The brand is Australian again. The recipe is unchanged. The factory still stands at 1 Vegemite Way, and the smell is heritage listed. But the building is for sale. The yeast comes from a Japanese-owned brewery, and the only reason any of it is still Australian at all is that a dairy cooperative from a small town decided that some things are worth buying back. Fred Walker invented it and died before it succeeded. Cyril Callister built it out of garbage, and almost nobody knows his name. The Americans owned it for 82 years, made it famous, and nearly destroyed it with a name that lasted 96 hours. And a farmers' cooperative from Bega brought it home. We're happy little Vegemites, as bright can be. The jingle is still true. The spread is still Australian. For now, against all the odds, and unlike almost every other icon in this series, it came home and it stayed. The brand survived. The empire that owned it is gone. And the black paste made from brewery waste is still on the shelf of every kitchen in the country, exactly where it has been for 100 years.